How did we get our Bibles, which are so available and usable today? This morning I had everybody raise their Bibles. There wasn't a person in here that didn't have their own copy of the Bible in English. That's amazing. So, the answer is, that's a long and fascinating story. I have done a year-long study of that. Don't worry, we're not doing that tonight. But you could very easily. It's a long story and fascinating. The Old Testament, as most of all of you know, was written in Hebrew and some parts in Aramaic, and the New Testament in Greek by about 40 different writers over a period of about 1,600 years. It's really a book of books, isn't it? What you may or may not know is we do not possess a single original autograph of any of the books of the Bible. Were you aware of that? There's nowhere on the face of the earth the original autograph of any of the books. I'm pausing to let that sink in. So the question then is, how can we be confident that our English versions are trustworthy when we don't even have the originals in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic? And I say that's a good question. And we should know how to answer that, because you can believe the critics are going to pound on that. So, the fact that so much time has passed, so many things have happened, it's difficult to translate from one language to another. How can we trust English Bibles? You can be assured that folks will tell you you cannot trust your English Bible, because we don't even have the originals in the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic. So how can you trust your English Bibles with all of this that's happened? So it is an actually excellent topic and a good question that needs to be dealt with. Deserves much more time than we'll give it. We're going to touch the veritable hem of the garments, the tips of the iceberg. What I always hope in a series like this is I give you enough to tease you into digging more deeply. So here we go. The answer to the question is, should you trust your English version, is no. You should not trust some of them. As I mentioned, the New World Translation put out by the Jehovah's Witness organization is not a careful translation. I would not trust it. For example, John 1:1, you remember? We showed you this morning. Their translation of John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, which only changes everything about the whole message of the New Testament, with one slight change in the translation. And such can happen with translations, folks, and so you need to be careful. Secondly, we said there are other versions that you better use careful judgment with regard to, because their purpose is a meaning for meaning translation as opposed to a careful word for word. And you need to look at the preface of the Bible you're using and see what it says, because it will explain to you their purposes. And two of those examples are the New English Bible and the NIV. All right, so these two versions have that as their basis, and so if I were you, if I were using the NIV, I would use something else with it and not rest solely on that version. Then, the most trustworthy versions are one translated by a large committee of scholars, produced with the intent of giving the world an accurate word-for-word translation. Pardon me if I go a little fast here. Of the best available Hebrew and Greek texts, the 5 that I recommended to you are as you see on the screen before you. I think those are the most reliable English translations that you can have in your possession at this point in time. But even these 5 and others give you variations. And we showed you several of those, and the reasons are multiple. Many recent discoveries of ancient manuscripts and other documents, and the relative importance given to these by committees of scholars, determine what they translate into English. So why are there variations in our English texts? One of the reasons depends on how much emphasis you put on different discoveries, as you'll see tonight. So we're going to focus tonight on the New Testament, ladies and gentlemen. I chose that because that's what we use mostly to guide our lives, isn't it? You can do the same kind of a study on the Old Testament. That's another 6 months. We're going to focus on the New Testament tonight. And so we're going to be looking then at the Greek, are we not? Because that's what the English or the Bible in the New Testament was written in to start with. There are variations in our English versions of the New Testament because there are variations in the Greek manuscripts and in the ancient versions of the New Testament. And the English comes from the Greek, right? So if there are variations in the Greek, there are going to be variations in the English as well. Pardon me. So, let's talk about the basis for our English versions of the New Testament in the Greek. And what you need to remember, and if you were in my class, we'd have a quiz on this in the morning. There are 3 great witnesses to the text of the New Testament, not just one. The 3 great witnesses I'm going to introduce to you, number 1 is manuscripts. Now, I'm going to see what you remember because I know you remember everything I said this morning. A manuscript is a handwritten document. Manu means hand, and script means write. So manuscript is handwritten. You are aware, aren't you, class, that prior to the 1400s, every text was handwritten. There was no printing press until the 1400s. So a manuscript is a handwritten document. In biblical textual studies, it's a handwritten document in the original language. In the case of the New Testament, that's Greek. So a handwritten copy of the text of the New Testament in Greek is called a manuscript. There are bunches of those that we'll describe in more detail in a minute. But let me first give you an illustration. Am I having problems? I'm giving all kinds of problems. I'm going to talk louder so I don't waste time. You see up there on the screen? Ancient documents. Livy's History of Rome was written in the 1st century. Livy was a historian in the 1st century. We have 20 manuscripts of that document in our possession on the face of the earth. The earliest of those is 500 years after he wrote it. You listening? That's typical. Somebody said yes. Good. Thank you. That's why you love to have kids in the class, isn't it? Caesar's Gallic Wars were written in the 1st century, same time as the New Testament. We have 10 manuscripts of that document. The earliest one is 900 years after he wrote it. It's a copy made 900 years later. Tacitus' Annals, that's another history, written in the 1st century. We have 2 manuscripts of that in all the world, and the earliest one is 800 years afterwards. It's a copy made 800 years later. Are you with me? That is very typical for ancient documents. What about the New Testament? There are 5,795 plus documents, manuscripts, partial or complete, of the New Testament that are in our possession somewhere on earth. You see that? There is no comparison with any other ancient book compared to the New Testament. 5,795 plus. And you know why I wrote the plus? Because we're still finding more, even as we speak. Handwritten Greek texts of the New Testament, copies thereof, in our possession. Here's the point. We can take these 5,795 plus manuscripts, compare them with each other, and ensure what the original text was, even though we don't have it. It makes the surety of the text very strong when you have that much evidence to support it. There is not another text in all of history that is even in the same light year as the New Testament in this regard. I told you, Livy has 20 manuscripts. Caesar's Gallic Wars has 10. The Scriptures, the New Testament, has over 5,700 manuscripts. That's just the manuscripts. So when God chose to preserve His Word, He preserved it marvelously compared to anything else ever written in the history of mankind. And here's what 1 Peter says about that. All flesh is as grass, the glory of man is as the flower of the grass withers and its flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is the word which by the gospel was preached to you. There's a promise in the Bible that the word of the Lord will endure forever. Even though we don't have the original autographs, we have the word of the Lord. And He's preserved it in a marvelous way. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about these manuscripts. One of them is the Rylands manuscript that dates back to 125 AD. It's a small piece of the book of John. But the three that are listed next there, Vatican, Sinaitic, and Alexandrian, are three of the most famous documents. They're the most precious of any documents in the world. And I'm coming back to those. There are 5,791 plus others besides those. Those are some of the most famous. But there's a second set of witnesses, and that's the versions. Versions are copies of the ancient text in a different language than the original. So in this case, the old Syriac dates to the 100s. Did you know, class, that the text of the New Testament was translated into Syriac early on? Name me a church in Syria. Antioch, thank you. Antioch was a good-sized congregation, wasn't it? Paul preached there. Barnabas went there. They sent out preachers from Antioch of Syria. It's reasonable that the text was translated into their language early on. So there's an old Syriac version of the New Testament. There's an old Latin version, which would have been the language spoken in Rome. There's an Ethiopic version. And can I get off the subject here just a minute? Sometimes I like to take little side trips. If you ever get the chance, beloved, to go to Berlin, you must go see the Bode Museum. And right next door to it is the Pergamum Museum. Don't you dare miss either one of those if you ever get to go to Berlin. And I highly recommend it. Inside the Pergamum Museum, there is an entire reconstruction of the Acropolis of the city of Pergamus. It's been transferred over to Germany and reconstructed. Right next door to that, when you walk out of that humongous space into the next one, you have the Ishtar Gate of Babylon reconstructed inside of that building. And a bunch of other stuff that's related to Bible history. In the Bode Museum, you're privileged to go in there and see a Coptic version of the book of Isaiah that dates back to the earliest centuries. And you can look at it. Could very well likely be similar to what the eunuch was reading in Acts 8. Fascinating stuff. That was all thrown in free of charge. But there are a bunch of ancient versions of the Bible too, in different languages, that help verify the text of the Bible. You with me? Hundreds of them. In addition to that, there's a third line of witnesses to the text of the New Testament, and it's the church fathers in Syriac, Greek, Coptic, and Latin. There were lots of leaders in the early church who made lots of copies of texts. They quoted Scripture. For example, one father would write a letter to another one, and he'd quote a bunch of Scripture in his letters. We have a bunch of that, handwritten, that has been preserved. In fact, it is said by Bruce Metzger, so extensive are the citations that if all other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they, that is the citations of early Christian writers, would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. So you could reconstruct the New Testament just from the quotes made in the letters and documents written by those early church fathers. So I said to you, this will be on your quiz in the morning. There are three great witnesses to the text of the New Testament. Manuscripts, of which there are over 5,700. Versions, of which there are hundreds in other languages. And the quotations, citations from the church fathers. Put all that together, class, and you have a massive amount of historical evidence undergirding the text of the New Testament. We can have great confidence in that because of the massive amount of evidence that's been preserved. Which leads me to want to talk to you a little bit about those manuscripts. The most ancient and most important of the manuscripts are the uncials. Anybody know what uncial means? Say it again.
They're all lowercase letters.
Well, they're all capital letters. Yeah, you're thinking of minuscules. Uncials are all caps. You see up here on the screen a piece of an ancient manuscript of the Bible that's an unseal. It's all capital letters. I've decided I'd put something in English for you and see if you can read it. Can you read that? Can you see it well enough? Why don't you read it out loud to it?
Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Called to be an apostle.
He's struggling, isn't he? I would struggle too if that's the way everything was written, wouldn't you? But can you read it? Yeah, you can. Takes time because you have to kind of figure out where are the words, right? Are you aware, class, that every ancient manuscript looked like that in Greek?
Buddy,
Yes, ma'am.
where are all these manuscripts?
Where are they located?
Where are they located?
They're located in all different museums all over the earth.
All over the world.
Yes, ma'am. They're not in one place.
All right.
A lot of them are in the Vatican,
I know.
and you aren't allowed in there.
I'm an ex-Catholic, so I know that.
Yes, ma'am. But not anywhere near all of them.
Oh,
No, there's 5,700 of them. They're scattered all over the earth. There's some at the University of Chicago. Yeah, there's some of these scattered in all different museums. One of the most famous is the British Museum, the British Library in London, England. If you ever get to go, I told you about one of those Coptic versions. It's in the Boda Museum, the book of Isaiah, that dates back to the 1st, 2nd century. It's amazing. But folks, in those early days, this is how they wrote, all capital letters. Do you see any punctuation up there? There's no punctuation. They're all capital letters. There's no breaks between words. So when the Ethiopian eunuch was reading Isaiah, it was very likely a scroll made out of animal skins with the entire text like that. Think about that. Did that man want to know what God said? No wonder God picked up a preacher and sent him physically to see that one man. And you know what I think? I think that one man who became a Christian after one lesson took the message of the gospel to Ethiopia. And it was but a few years later that we have records that there were hundreds of Christians in Ethiopia. And this is all a side trip too, but did you know, class, that there are thousands of New Testament Christians in Ethiopia today? And many of our brethren have been over there preaching and teaching the preachers who are natives. And the gospel is spreading like wildfire in Ethiopia in the 21st century. Isn't that exciting? Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God which he promised. And I've read that a few times. But that's how you had to read the ancient uncials. Amazing. Later, cursives came along, and that's what you were talking about, or minuscules, which used more like a cursive writing, kind of like ours. Smaller letters and cursive-like in appearance, easier to read. These date from the 9th century, the 800s. There are about 2,800 of them extant. Do you know the word extant? That means they exist somewhere on earth. You can go physically see them. But cursives, ladies and gentlemen, didn't start until the 800s. So the uncials are more important in terms of their ancient pedigree, right? Cursives are important, but not as important as the uncials. Okay. The most important uncials of all are these three, the oldest vellum manuscripts. Anybody know what vellum is? It's calf skins. You know how much trouble it is to take a calf skin and convert it into something you can write on? It's a lot of work. But it turned out that vellum was one of the most prized possessions when it was properly treated as a document writing surface. First of all, it didn't decay as rapidly as a lot of other material like papyrus. There are lots of ancient papyrus documents also, but they're not preserved as well. So these three are all the oldest vellum manuscripts we have in possession. Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus. Why are they called a codex? Because, folks, these are actually collected in book form, where you can open up and there are leaves to it instead of scrolls. And that's began to happen in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So these three codices, if you like, almost complete copies of the New Testament and most of the Old Testament as well. They are manuscripts for the New Testament. They are versions for the Old Testament because they're in Greek. But they contain practically the entire Bible. Interesting. Codex Alexandrinus came from Alexandria. That's where the name came from. Dates to the 400s. Notice it's 2 columns of carefully transcribed, handwritten. Every letter on that document was written by some scribe with his hand, with a pen, not a ballpoint, with special ink, letter by letter by letter. Folks, those scribes were so meticulous, they knew exactly what letter they should be on when they got to the bottom of that left column. And if it wasn't that way, guess what? You start over. No Xerox. They were extremely meticulous. Codex Vaticanus, guess why it's named that? It's located in the Vatican. For we don't even know how long it was in the Vatican before people were told about it. It was kept a secret. Later, it was opened up to the public for the scrutiny of scholars. I told you this morning that when the King James Version of the English Bible in 1611 was translated, none of these three were available to them. They're only the most important ancient manuscripts supporting the text of the Bible. They had to go with what they had. But none of these three were available to those translators. And here's Codex Sinaiticus. I'll tell you what, I wish we had another hour. I'd love to tell you the story of the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus. I want to tease you. You need to go read this story. It's better than the Raiders of the Lost Ark. The guy who discovered him was a world-respected expert on the text of the New Testament. He set it as a life's goal to find every single document on the face of the earth that could support the text of the New Testament. And he traveled everywhere. It was in the 1800s. Amazing story. And that's all I'm going to tell you, because I want you to look at it. Now, here's the fascinating thing. That text is located in the British Library in London. You can go see it. But that text has a long and fascinating history that allowed it finally, at first it went to Russia first. And then the British bought it from Russia when they were in bad need of money. And it was transported to England. I will tell you, that was a worldwide event when that took place. And now, ladies and gentlemen, you can look at the text of Codex Sinaiticus. Any of you can go online, click a few buttons, and see the text of Codex Sinaiticus. And so Todd, with the miracles of modern science, is going to show us Codex Sinaiticus. He's going to go to the website that's labeled Codex Sinaiticus. I think. What's Bink? There it is. That's the website for Codex Sinaiticus. And ladies and gentlemen, what's happened is that entire codex has been digitized and put on this website so anybody has access to it. There you see before you a part of the text of the book of Genesis. The early part of that manuscript is in terrible shape. Most of it's in wonderful shape, but certain parts of it are not in good shape. All right, so I'm going to ask you then, Todd, to turn to John 1:1. Can you do that? Are we having problems? Oh, you can't see it. There you go. All right, so what you see right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the text of John 1:1 in Greek, handwritten. And we know what it says, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, then Word was God. There is the Greek text of John 1:1 right there. And of course, 4 columns in this case, carefully handwritten. And what you can't see very well is, do you see that there's a few little things written in the columns here? You'll find that throughout the Codex Sinaiticus. You'll also find sometimes things written in the side light there. And of course, we think the scribes would sometimes add little notes to the text. All right. And I'd love to spend a lot of time with you on this, but we've got lots of else to do. So I'm going to go next to Mark 16. You remember we talked about Mark 16 this morning? Let's go to Mark 16, Todd. So you just go up there and identify Mark 16. And then go to verse, click the verse. Notice it only goes up to verse 8. How many verses in Mark 16? 20. There it is. All right, notice right there. Here's Mark 16 as it is in Codex Sinaiticus. There's the end of it. It's verse 8. And then there's a big blank space here, and that's the beginning of the book of Luke. Interesting. In Codex Sinaiticus, Mark 16, 9 through 20 is missing. It's also missing in Vaticanus. So that's why some translators into English leave that section out and put it in a footnote. Because they put great weight on the value of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and less weight on other things. So the question is this, class: does Mark 16, 9 through 20 belong in the Bible? It's not in Codex Sinaiticus. It's not in Codex Vaticanus. May I suggest to you, class, there are books written about this. Whole books. So of course, first of all, I haven't read them. I've read sections of things. But there are whole books written about this. So we're not even touching the hem of the garment. But you may notice, does it look like there might have been something in there? Kind of interesting. There's a lot of things said about this as to why that section's not there in those two manuscripts. But what we need to get at, class, is what is the evidence for the text of the Bible as a whole? So I must leave this website, Todd. Take me back to my slides, please. Isn't it nice just to say, do it? And what? He's doing what we call toggling. And he's toggling back to my slides. Todd, it's taken you too long. Oh, there you go. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're back to this. And I'm talking to you about the three major unsealed manuscript evidence for the text of the New Testament, right? That's where we are. So we're back to our topic. The Greek New Testament, divinely inspired in its original autographs, was transmitted to us through the hands of copyists. Ladies and gentlemen, the copies were made by hand for 1,400 years. Ancient versions and any other writings that took place back then were made by hand. In some cases, copyists were looking at earlier copies as they made their copies. So imagine, here's an old text, and here's your blank vellum, and you're taking a pen and dipping it in the ink, and you're writing letter by letter by letter what's over here onto this one. Hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. Some folks spent their entire lives doing nothing but copying text. Boring. But were it not for what those scribes did, beloved, you would not have the text of what God said. And they were willing to give their lives so you could have what God says. Pretty amazing. In other cases, they were listening to the reading of earlier copies. How do you mass produce hand copies of something? I'll tell you how. We put all of you in a room and we give you your own setup, and I'm going to stand up here and read to you the text, and you're going to write what I read. That's called a scriptorium. And so therefore, for one reading, you can produce 100 copies. But it depends on you listening to me. And if you're like a lot of you, you're not very good. And besides that, you can't spell. But that's how they mass produce hand copies. Would you agree that human copyists are susceptible to slips and faults of either the eye or the ear? Of course they are. You think some of those slipped into the texts? Absolutely did. Scribes were also sometimes susceptible to trying to improve a text by making it agree with other passages of Scripture because they knew their Bibles. And we know for a fact that sometimes there were notes put in the side here that end up in the text. Okay? And you say, if that kind of stuff was going on, how can you trust the text? And I will answer it this way first. We have 5,795 plus, and we can compare them and come to a pretty solid conclusion as to what was in the text. From one point of view, it could be said that there are over 200,000 errors in the Greek New Testament text when you put all this stuff together. And you can be assured, if you've ever talked to a critic who wants to undermine the Bible, he will say, even the Greek text has 200,000 errors in it. How can you trust anything with that many mistakes? So how can you even trust the modern Greek text, much less English? It's a good question. This large number of errors is gained by counting all the variations in all the manuscripts. For example, if there's one slight variation that occurs in 4,000 manuscripts, that's 4,000 errors. No, I say that's one error copied 4,000 times. But that's the way it's counted to make it look as bad as possible. And I say that is not anything but a misleading way to count things. So I'm going to show you how's the proper way to count it. That's the next point tonight. And so I've learned long since you're going to forget 99% of what I said. I want you to remember certain things tonight. So here's one big one. My kids in the class would say, is it going to be on the test? Yes! How should we look at variations in the manuscripts? Are there variations? Yes, there are. Class, in 86% of the text of the New Testament, there are no variations. With 5,700 and some odd manuscripts. Manuscripts, handwritten copies, 86% of the text there's no question about. Does that blow you away? It should. It's incredible to be able to say this, but it is absolutely the truth. So I like to illustrate it this way. Here's my copy of the New Testament. I'm going to start here in Matthew, and of course this is a little messed up because some of these pages have pictures on them, and other kinds of helps, but it's close enough for government work. Here we go. So here is the New Testament in my Bible right here. 253 pages. 218 of those pages are identical in all the manuscripts. What does that leave? 35. So I'm going to take out exactly 35 pages here. This much of the text of the New Testament in all the manuscripts is identical. Leaves 35 pages in which there are variations. Now they're scattered throughout it, you understand. Another 30 and a half pages is spelling variations. I told you, spelling. That's another 12%. That leaves 4.5 pages, right? Okay. We're down to 4.5 pages. Let me show you what some of those spelling variations are. Often words in Greek copies are spelled differently over a period of years. For example, EI is interchanged for I, AI is interchanged for E, Bethzatha becomes Bethesda. Does that affect the text of the Bible, ladies and gentlemen? It does not. Most of the variations that we do find are spelling variations. But if it's spelled one way in this manuscript and another way in that one, that's a variant. But most of them have absolutely no effect on the text. Then there's another 1.5%, 3.25 pages that are minor variations. Let me give you an example. Matthew 1:18. In one manuscript it says the birth of Jesus Christ. In another one it says the birth of Christ Jesus. That's a variant. In another one it says the birth of Jesus. In another one it says the birth of Christ. That's 4 variants on that one passage. Horrible, isn't it? Horrible. Doesn't change anything. But they are variants in the manuscripts. And if we're going to be real, that is a variation. Why didn't it end up exactly the same? Well, it didn't. It's copyists, I think. So that leaves us, class, with 1.25 pages of any significant variation. 3 of those I brought up this morning. The longest one is Mark 16, 9 through 20. But when you put any significant variation at all together, you have 1.25 pages. out of 253 of any significance. Acts 8:37. So what do you do with Acts 8:37, class? If you're a biblical textual critic, your decision is, does Acts 8:37 belong in the scriptures? Or was it added later?
Doesn't matter, it agrees with other scripture.
Thank you. But here's what a textual critic does with it. First of all, here's the different English versions that we looked at this morning. You remember the New King James Version says, little star, N-U and M omit verse 37 that's found in Western texts, including the Latin traditions, kind of a broad summary statement. Here's what the textual critic will say to you. What's the support for this verse? In all of those manuscripts and versions, what's the support for it? 1 6th century uncial has it in it. 6th century, that's the 500s. Some good minuscules have it in it, but minuscules date to after the 800s. The old Latin version, which dates back pretty far, but hardly anything else. Now I've got to get back to this. What does N-U and M mean? Do you see that, what that says there in the footnote? N-U and M omit verse 37. What is N-U? N-U is the Greek text of the 26th edition of Nestle Aland Greek New Testament, that's the N, and the 3rd edition of the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, that's the U. These are two collections of the documents that we have to support the text of the Bible, and they are collections together from the best studies men can do of all the text available. N-U leaves out verse 37. M, what does that one mean? It's called the majority text. It holds that the best Greek text is based on the consensus of the majority of existing Greek manuscripts, even though many are late and none earlier than the 5th century. The majority text says if it's in the majority of all the texts we've ever gotten, then it should be in there. It also leaves out verse 37. You listening? So what's the opposition to this verse? Practically all other manuscripts and versions do not have it. Those are facts, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have to believe me. You go check for yourself. I mean, those manuscripts and all the stuff written about them are available to all of you. And I'm telling you, all the other manuscripts and versions, practically every one of them doesn't have that verse in it. And no Greek manuscript earlier than the 6th century knows anything about this reading. So the question is, does Acts 8:37 belong in the text of the Bible? The American Standard Version leaves it out and puts it in a footnote. In some cases, not even in a footnote. So does it belong there, doesn't it? You want my opinion? As not an expert, I think the overwhelming weight of the evidence is against Acts 8:37 being in the text. That's my opinion. Remember, that's one part of 1.25 pages of the entire New Testament. That's one little part of it. What about 1 John 5? This is a second question text. Remember, class, can I say this again? Most of the Bible there's no questions about. There's only a few passages. 1 John 5 is another one. What's the support for these verses in the King James, as used in the King James Version? Erasmus's 3rd edition of the Greek New Testament, which happened to be the one Tyndale used when he translated it into English, which was the basis for the old King James Version, Tyndale. He used Erasmus's Greek text. Well, you know, the story about Erasmus is he said, if I can find one manuscript that has it in it, I'll stick it in there. They finally found for him a 14th century manuscript that had it in it. And he stuck it in there. 2 other manuscripts have this rendition of the verses written in the margin. You listening? I want to say that again. 2 other manuscripts have this rendition in the margin. And then sometime in the 14th, 15th century, somebody stuck it in the text. It looks to me like. Late Latin versions also have it. That's the support for that verse. What's the opposition to that verse as it's in the King James? Practically all other manuscripts and versions, there is no Greek manuscript earlier than the 14th century that knows this reading that you have in your King James Version. You want my opinion? I think some scribe took it out of the margin and stuck it in the text at some point in time, and that it's not well supported. The manuscript evidence against that particular version of 1 John 5 is not well supported, class. I would use the American Standard and the New American Standard on that one. Again, can I remind you for the 3rd time? This is one small piece of the 1 1/4 pages that have any question whatsoever. And how about Mark 16, 9 through 20? That's a pretty significant chunk of Scripture. As I showed you, it's missing from Sinaiticus. Vatican and Sinaitic manuscripts do not have the closing verses of Mark 16 in them. But I'll tell you, class, when you read lots of those books, they will say there are some reasons it could have been missing from those 2. Earliest known copies of the Old Syriac and Latin Vulgate do not have this, and a large number of Armenian manuscripts don't have it. What's the support for these verses? Almost all other manuscript evidence that exists have it in it. A statement from Irenaeus, one of the church fathers, shows its existence in the 2nd century. I am absolutely convinced the text of Mark 16 is hugely supported by the textual evidence. So why is it missing in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus? I don't know the final answer to that, but there's certainly some possibilities explaining why. You can have great confidence in Mark 16, 9 through 20 as being part of the text of the Bible, in this non-expert's opinion. But that's what they do with it. That's what biblical textual critics do. Look, all they've got to work with is 1 1/4 pages here, so they don't have much to do. They still write volumes about it. It's always interesting to me how much you can write about something you know nothing about, or very little about. So there you have the summary, class, of the text of the Bible. Can you count on the text of the New Testament in Greek? You absolutely can. And if you take all of those significant variations, not one single doctrinal issue is impacted by any of them. I pause on purpose. I want that to sink in. So don't you let textual critics of the Bible tell you you can't count on the text of the New Testament, because you can. And there are the 3 great witnesses that undergird it. You add all those together, you can be very confident. The interval then between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. The last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established, says Sir Frederick Kenyon in the Bible and Archaeology in 1940. And we found more supporting evidence since then. We can have great confidence in the Greek text of the New Testament and the Hebrew text of the Old that provide the basis for our modern English versions of the Bible. We can also have great confidence in English versions that are translated by large committees of scholars who are committed to giving the world an accurate word-for-word translation of the best available Greek and Hebrew texts, of which there are numbers of those. You see, God said the word of the Lord endures forever. And you are blessed, class, to have it in the vulgar tongue of English. And by the way, may I add as we conclude, that you were born and raised in a country where you learned English from the time you were born. And you live in a time when everybody on earth wants to speak English. I've been in 28 countries. Everywhere I've been, people wish they could speak English. Lots of children are taught English as a second language in their schools all the time. I can tell you in Romania that in the communist days, they made them learn Russian and they hated it. When they finally kicked out the Russians, everybody wanted English. And I was hired to teach conversational American English in 2 high schools in Romania. They're taught British English, but they want American English. And you were born into it. Do you think God's going to hold us accountable? We speak a language everybody wants to speak in this time on the face of the earth. In addition to that, we talked about 1989. The reason that year was so dramatic, young people, is because the entire Soviet empire crumbled before our eyes. And the message of the gospel was opened up to those countries for the first time in ages, long time. And I was privileged to be a small part of taking the gospel into a country that wasn't allowed to have preachers in it. You think God's going to ask you one day, what did you do to help the gospel get? What else could I do for you, ladies and gentlemen? God might say, I opened the world to you. What are you doing about it? You have the English Bible. One last comment. There are still hundreds of languages into which the Bible has not been translated. Did you know that? Now, most commonly spoken languages have the Bible translated. You want to do something special? How about helping support Bible translations of the Bible into other languages where it's not happened yet and where people can study it in their own language? There's so many things you can do sitting right here in Taylor, South Carolina without going anywhere to help the message of the gospel go all over this earth. And I don't know what you're going to say to Jesus one day when he says, what did you do with what I opened up to you? I don't know what I'm going to say because I want to do way more. And I pray that for all of you as well. So, again, that wasn't the theme of this lesson, but it sure falls right out of it, doesn't it? And thank you for your careful attention, and thank you for letting me do this as a class. It fits better as a class, it seems to me. And I hope you're taking something home with you of great value for future use for the Lord's sake.